when this polarization happens, like out of one comes out many that tend to polarize in a way that you can, in our imagination, our experience, we can think of it this way. At the extreme upper end of it, there will be some kind of an extreme consciousness, supra-consciousness. And at the other end of it, which is way below us, would be supreme unconsciousness, or what Sri Aurobindo calls total inconscient. That spark, when it shows up in the middle of the densest levels of consciousness
Yeah.
and begins to guide the process of an upward evolution, as we spoke before, eventually it becomes the agency that accumulates in interactions and experiences in these different levels of consciousness. And these experiences are sometimes called samskaras. Samskaras are impressions, that are made. Like for example, a plant has interaction with the environment. It receives impressions, if there's light, if there's water, anything that's in the environment puts an impression on this plant. So that plant is able to process these impressions and make use of them. So in the same way as we go from the, stone level, or from the,
Yeah.
physical, to densest physical, to the more vital level, these impressions also evolve, and with it, various creatures form, so we have the mineral, and then we
We're
have
not just saying that this is an evolutionary soul, a soul that develops and grows with the evolutionary process in matter. Yeah.
yes, and it gathers experiences.
Gathers it. Yeah.
These experiences, as it goes from the, stone to vegetable to animal, and then eventually to the human, these experiences become part of a cluster, if you will, or a formation around that core spark that has been leading this process. That core spark is the key to the intelligence behind evolution. It
Yeah.
guides it from way in the back. In the West, however, in the idea of epiphenomenalism and the idea that consciousness evolves out of matter,
Yeah.
this is absolutely just an assumption that
Yeah.
science has taken up without questioning, and certain material
Yeah.
monists have taken up this assumption, which now most scientists just somehow believe in. There is absolutely no research or no demonstration of how this is possible. It's more like science is saying, with all its sophistication, is that, okay, there's nerves and the brain, and there's something like consciousness, so it must be related to that. It sure is coming from that. Look at the complexity. Look at,
Yeah.
but there's no literature that can prove or demonstrate or even create a conversation around why, that's the case. It's just something that's taken for granted unconsciously.
So this was a very inspiring and insightful first conversation I had with Bahman Shirazi about integral psychology, integral yoga, but more broadly speaking, about a spiritual, philosophical, and psychological paradigm that goes beyond the conventional psychology and spirituality and metaphysics. In fact, aim of these interviews is to illustrate how we can develop a wider perspective on these subjects. But first, let me tell you something about Bahman. Bahman Shirazi received his PhD in East-West psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies, CIIS. He was an adjunct faculty and also worked in various administrative positions at CIIS for 25 years, including several years as director of graduate studies and as CIIS archivist and historian. Bahman has also taught at several other Bay Area schools such as John F. Kennedy University, ITP Sophia University, and Dominican University in the areas of integral and transpersonal psychology, Sufi psychology, and research methodology. He has published a number of book chapters and articles on various topics in integral psychology and has served as guest editor for Revision and Integral Review journals. He is currently an editor for Collaboration Journal. So much for his figure, and I hope you will enjoy this conversation. It can be at times a bit complicated because it goes beyond our conventional way of seeing and perceiving ourselves and our psychology and our metaphysical, also religious, philosophical worldview. But I hope that you will enjoy this conversation. If so, and you would like to have more information about what I call the integral cosmology of Sri Aurobindo, you can also download a link to a longer essay that I wrote in the description. Last but not least, don't forget to leave a like. But can we perhaps give a brief and fast, intuitive understanding of what it is? Because if I would be new to integral yoga, integral psychology, to Sri Aurobindo, or any of these kind of also yoga philosophy and psychology and practice, when I would read, if I would read Parts and Planes, or Planes and Parts, I think it was
Yeah.
Planes and Parts.
Yeah, parts of being and planes of consciousness. Yeah,
Parts
I
of
think
Being and Planes of Consciousness.
yes, I think that would be a more appropriate.
Yeah,
Sure. Well, I think that it's important to start with this introduction, or uh, just to say that Sri Aurobindo never created a theory of all the parts and planes of being, or created a map of things that he put out. Uh, in some of his writings, some of his main writings, he's talked about some of these things. And then mostly in the letters, when people have
yeah,
asked for clarification, he has elaborated on many of that. So uh, some picture has emerged over time,
letters
and
on yoga, no? Yeah,
yes, and uh, Dr. Dalal, especially A.S. Dalal, who has done a lot of work summarizing Sri Aurobindo's work, um, has put out a couple of important books. One was, well, just 1 second. I think it's called A Greater Psychology,
great
which came out a long time ago. And then there's another book called Our Many Selves. I think these two books are important for anyone who's interested in this topic. He does actually create a graphic there, which is helpful, but of
yeah.
course, it's a two-dimensional graphic, yeah, but it gets to the core and the essential aspects of Sri Aurobindo's
Mhm.
uh, sort of worldview. So we talked about previously talked about the whole being, and so this is about, well, what is the whole being? Usually when you talk about a whole, you talk about the parts as well. So what is this whole and part relationship, and so on? So this is, the topic. So it would be easy to read through all these things and to create a mental map of this. I would caution against that because, again, this is a psychology of experience. So it would be best to really try to experience these things, maybe taking aspects of it and meditating on it. There are visualization practices one can create even that take you through all the parts and planes, and you become more familiar with them in an actual maybe meditation session. So, but the idea that Sri Aurobindo presented is a more elaborate version of what was already in Indian psychology,
Yeah.
Indian yoga psychology. In traditional psychology, you had the koshas, the food sheath, the vital sheath, the mental sheath, so on. So Sri Aurobindo basically elaborates on these. And in the West, also, I should say, because of theosophists who brought the terminology of Indian yoga psychology and metaphysics into the West. There has been something of a triune um, idea of different levels, such as what they call the physical or the gross physical, and then um, vital is something that Sri Aurobindo has used, but it's usually astral that they use, or some
Yeah,
people call it subtle physical, which is actually a little bit different than vital.
yeah.
But and then there's causal, which is
Mhm.
the same as mental,
Supramental, yeah.
and yeah, and in other traditions also there are similar things to this. But Sri Aurobindo has really given many layers because of his experience to these traditional teachings. And the way that Dr. Dalal presents this, which is very useful, is to think of two different things, thinking of a kind of a ladder structure of planes of consciousness, and then a concentric way of looking at this, which means looking at the outer experience and the inner experience, and then going to the core of the inner experience. So again, in other traditions such as Sufism, there is that outer inner, and it's very core and central to them. So these teachings are not something that you can say, oh, this was an invention of Sri Aurobindo and there's
No,
nothing like
no,
it. It's
no.
actually very close to world mysticism teachings, but it's very elaborate. Now, these planes of consciousness, if you read Aurobindo or Meher Baba, you might get a sense that everything in this world that we experience has started as a from an origin which is more like oneness or Satchidananda, as Sri Aurobindo calls it, or in typical Indian psychology and metaphysics, or Brahman. There's this great um, very hard to understand in ordinary experience way of relating to the whole. And that means not only the individual experience, but the universal experience and also the transcendent experience. So all of these together, packed in one, would be the origin. But then somehow in this original state, Brahman, but even then there is discussion in Indian psychology or metaphysics of even of something like para-Brahman, something that even was beyond Brahman, that's unfathomable totally to us. That this origin somehow in manifestation becomes polarized in some way, where it leads to uh, a differentiation between grades of consciousness. Now, this means that consciousness is the most fundamental element here. And that's an assumption that, is very important to keep in mind because many other psychologies and metaphysics may not, especially Western ones, may not
Yeah,
understand this or agree with this, but
yeah, I know this
consciousness,
all too well. Yeah.
yes, consciousness is not something that we normally think about, which is awareness, for example,
Mm,
like mental awareness or
mm.
physical awareness or sensation. I mean, there are gradations of those kinds of awareness, but consciousness is something fundamental to the universe, the way maybe quarks are fundamental to physics or something like that, something that's so elemental. And so when this polarization happens, like out of one comes out many that tend to polarize in a way that you can, in our imagination, our experience, we can think of it this way. At the extreme upper end of it, there will be some kind of an extreme consciousness, supra-consciousness. And at the other end of it, which is way below us, would be supreme unconsciousness, or what Sri Aurobindo calls total inconscient. So keeping in mind that
Nascent, yeah.
yeah, just
How do you
like
pronounce this in English? Nascent, nascent,
uh,
nascent?
inconscient or inconscient, probably. I've heard both of that,
Yeah, but Sherbindo used the word Nescient.
Yeah,
Nascent, nascent.
nascent, yeah,
Yeah,
I think nascent
nascent.
or nascent will both be acceptable.
That which knows nothing. Yeah.
Yes,
Uh,
yes.
It and yet has a spark of consciousness still
Yes,
in
yes,
sleeping mode. Yeah.
yes. That's actually very important that you mentioned that, because if you actually think of the yin yang symbol in Taoism,
Yeah.
you know, that also points to something similar. There's a polarization, but it's not a dichotomy, it's a complementary
Complementary. Yeah.
relationship. And in the white section, there's a black dot. In the black section, there's a white
Okay.
dot.
Ah,
These,
yeah.
these two dots actually, if superimposed, they would create the origin. And the polarization creates this very hard to understand in rational terms,
Yeah.
dynamic, complementary, multifaceted relationship that is consciousness, you know. So this is the world of creation, and then above that, the origin still stays intact, you know. So this is basically, you know, these different gradations happens because consciousness, in Sri Aurobindo's terms, becomes involved. That means it becomes created out of this first into mental levels of consciousness. And he talks about several different gradations of that, and then into vital or energy levels, and then into the what we know of physical, and that even has many different levels. So these gradations are almost like if someone had to come down from the roof and they put a ladder down and they, you know, use the ladder to come
Yeah.
down step by step, you know, the creation, what comes down from this ladder is a point of individuality, which is one with that universal Brahman. This point is usually called Atman. So Atman and Brahman, they always say it's the same, one and the same thing. Atman or Atma is the seed of individuality that comes down this ladder, and with it brings the knowledge or the light and the power of that supreme, but it becomes hidden in the lowest levels of the inconscient, becomes totally covered up, and yet has this power to actually push up again a process that Sri Aurobindo calls evolution of
Mm.
consciousness, where from behind the scene it guides the process of
Yeah.
evolution of consciousness, then through these planes of inconscience to something that's below the level of normal consciousness. He calls the subconscious, and then going up to our normal experiences, and then above to supra-conscious levels. There are different levels of mind, ultimately to the highest planes that he calls the supermind, and that becomes the gate back to the transcendent, to Brahman. So keeping in mind this, you know, metaphysics, what he adds to it is that there's more. There's also the outer being is what we experience, because when we're in the physical world and the vital world and the mental world, we also have these dimensions in our experience. And then you go inside of yourself. And that doesn't mean the physical inside, like not to go inside the physical body, but if you
Yeah.
meditate
Go
and
go
go
closer.
into the inner realm of consciousness, you will then see that there's a replication of these same triple manifestation. There's a inner vital, inner physical, and inner mental, not in that order, but you find those things right in there, you know. So it's hard to really use a, you know, probably some kind of a more sophisticated, holistic, um, graphic
Mind
solution
map.
might
Yeah.
might might help. But the thing to keep in mind is that our outer being and inner being are both made up of these gradations. So these gradations of consciousness somehow interface with the outer being and the inner being. And then you go deeper within, if possible, to the core of our inner being, and that core touches again to that point, that
Yeah.
that point that is the soul. And around that soul, again, there's a triple formation, you know, the inmost physical, in most vital, and in most mental. So it gets complicated if you think
Yeah.
about it like that. But to keep it simple, there's always a triple manifestation. And then, very broadly, I think, for general
Wait a
introduction
moment. Was
purposes.
it triple manifestation? So three is
Well, the sort of simple version of it would be that there's a mental realm, there's a vital realm, and there's a physical realm, and
okay.
that is replicated both on the outer and the inner, and even at the inner core of our being. So this is pretty much where I'd like to leave it because we'll come back maybe to touch on this again, but there's a general kind of view like this in
Yeah. If I may take a bit the Western perspective, uh, um, i- i- let me perhaps repeat it in a much less elegant way as you have done, but that perhaps can give another perspective is taking also a bit the first person perspective, where we go already try to connect with these things that you are saying, at least a bit so intuitively, even it's the real realization, the real contact is something else. It goes into the mystic experience and so on. But I think we can relate to these things a bit because, for example, when we speak about the mental and the vital, yeah, the mental, I repeat this a bit for what we said in the last time, but since we are here on a different channel, let me repeat this again, because I think there is a difference between the mind, the body, and consciousness. Yeah?
yes,
So the mind, in the Western perspective, if you're a physicalist, you say it's all one, it's all a product, an epiphenomenon of the brain, and that's it. But this is another thing, and we are a bit more spiritual, metaphysical here, and accept that there is um, not simply a dualism, because I think in the West we are still stuck in this dualistic perspective that does not go beyond this duality, because here we have different planes and parts. Yeah. The Western perspective is a bit stuck with Descartes, mind and body. The mind is something immaterial and the body is something material, and nobody knows how they could interact and so all that stuff.
yes, yeah,
Of course, if you are so coarse-grained, it is inevitable that then inconsistencies bubble up. Um, but let's go a bit inside. I say always to people, observe how you see your thoughts. Your thoughts come and go, come and go. But there is a
yes,
witness consciousness
yeah,
that is aware of these thoughts coming and going. And with the word mind, usually in our language, we mean the thoughts. So the witness is something that is permanent. The thoughts are something impermanent. So it
yes.
cannot be the same thing.
Yes, yes, the
Uh,
subject and the object of consciousness. At least that should be fairly easy for most people to relate
Yeah,
to.
that's why I say let's take a bit this first person perspective, so also that people can connect through to these philosophical concepts also through their own experience. So we have already mind and consciousness are not the same. So I would say the consciousness is it the dot that you were talking about? It's not really. It's because there's still the ego formation, this sense of subjectivity, no? Is it? But it is something that goes nearer to this central dot that you were mentioning, no? Which is,
Yeah, I'll come back to that too when we talk about the soul a little bit more.
yeah, yeah,
Maybe just the one brief comment on what you just said is that in the West, however, in the idea of epiphenomenalism and the idea that consciousness evolves out of matter,
yeah,
this is absolutely just an assumption that
yeah,
science has taken up without questioning, and certain material
Yeah.
Monists have taken up this assumption, which now most scientists just somehow believe in. There is absolutely no research or no demonstration of how this is possible. It's more like science is saying, with all its sophistication, is that okay, there's nerves and the brain, and there's something like consciousness, so it must be related to that. It sure is coming from that. Look at the complexity. Look at,
Mm.
but there's no literature that can prove or demonstrate or even create a conversation around why, that's the case. It's just something that's taken for granted unconsciously.
It is a sort of dogmatism,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
But
exactly.
that's why I invite people to go with the first person experience. Let me also continue this thing. Then let us see. So we are somehow, there's a consciousness, a witness, there are thoughts coming and going, but there's also something else. We are not just only thoughts, but we are also emotions, feelings. Um, there is, yeah, instincts that drive us, desires. Are these thoughts? I wouldn't say that these are thoughts. When I think, for example, as a mathematical formula, I am using an analytic mind, an abstract faculty or form of cognition. When I have a strong emotion, a fear, or something that makes me angry, it's not the same thing it's not the same mind. It's something else. And that's what we call here in this context as vital. Huh? The vital aspect of ourselves that is made of desires, emotions, feelings, drives, and then there's the so-called, what Sri called the higher and lower vital, and the inner and outer. But to keep things simple, let us go inside and see, well, there are also these emotions. I feel these emotions, these desires, these strong things that drive me. Huh? So we have mind, body, and the emotional body, which here we will call the vital bone, or the pranamaya kosha in the Indian Sanskrit yoga philosophy. Then there is also subconscious or so here it's just terminology. Should we call it subconscious, unconscious, inconscious or unconscious? What? So yes, 3%. What do you use usually? Subconscious,
Well, the idea of subconscious is not a technical Western psychology term. It's been used in the popular psychology and by many people, but
yeah,
Shiorba actually uses that. In
yeah,
traditional psychoanalysis, Freud, the idea was unconscious,
unconscious.
and
Okay.
it refers to something that has a dynamism of its own and associated with repressed materials and so on, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah.
Uh, Inconscient and subconscient are different
Mm.
gradations of consciousness in Sri Aurobindo. So there's an increasing level of consciousness. I don't know what analogy to use, but if consciousness was a substance, and if it was, maybe we'd use a golden or white dot to represent the substance, and the unconsciousness was a dark substance, the inconscient would be all dark. And then, slowly you'd have specks of the bright substance emerging during evolution to a point where there is increasing degrees of that. And eventually, at some point, we become aware of things, and the whole dilemma, Marco, is this, that because of this unconsciousness or whatever term we use for it, there's a problem with actually knowing what you just said, that we're so much creatures of the mind, we're so much in the mind. Like they say, the fish doesn't question the water, The
Yeah.
fish is not aware of being in the water. Only when it's thrown out of water, all of a
Yeah.
sudden it starts to show reaction. It's taken for granted that that's the atmosphere. Same way we take air for granted. We hardly, unless we're a physicist or we have a reason, we hardly see or experience or are aware of air. We're just in it, you know. In the same way, psychologically, we're so much in the mental plane that we're not aware of being in the mental plane. So the
Yeah.
exercises, the meditation, such as Vipassana meditation, you know, witness consciousness meditation that, or other methods similar to that, are a way of separating the subject and object in such a way that we could actually see the observer against the phenomenon of what's in front of consciousness, you know. So, you know, that's something very difficult for ordinary people. And then in terms of the emotional and the vital levels, that may even be more difficult. Of course, it really depends
Yeah.
on the psychological type. You know, some people are more sense aware, some are more in the mind, in the thoughts, some are more in the body, physical. You know, but you know, for a lot of people, emotions are processed more in terms of like good or bad, you know, like
Mm.
feeling good or bad, you know, or maybe actually there's something in the middle, like, you know, neither bad nor good. But usually what drives us is craving for good feeling, you know, and so a lot of our psychology is about going for what creates good feeling in us, which, you know, unfortunately is often pleasure seeking, which doesn't really give us what we want, but we continue repeating that process, or avoiding pain, you know. So in yoga, many forms of spiritual practice as well, they say try not to go after these pleasures and things and try not to avoid those, you know, just be with whatever arises. So that's a very important distinction. All the other distinctions that have been made in philosophy about subject and object of consciousness and a lot of discussions and so on, those are really abstract.
Mm.
uh, you know, I'm not even sure to what degree each philosopher who's been involved in these things has been only in the mind, kind of reflecting on their own, or have had more experience of it. But anyway, who knows? But basically, for most human beings, there's very little awareness of, for example, the physical body unless it causes a problem, unless we become, you know, uncomfortable, pain arises or something like that. But even a lot of that is unconscious, you know, because, for example, when one is sitting in a certain posture in a room, oftentimes people shift their posture, you know, many times an hour, but we may not even be aware of it, you know. We just, you know, shift because after a while, the pain builds up in the knees or in
But it's
the
perhaps
back, or you know, we just
fortunate that it
shifted.
is.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
just did. I just got up and shifted my position, and I may not even be aware of it. I can turn my attention to it. So unconsciousness is a real issue, I think, in both psychology and in yoga, you know, because a lot of what happens below this level of normal consciousness, which is very limited. It's mostly mind-based, and it's the interaction of mind and sense data that comes from the senses in the body, including the body, but the visual and the auditory and so on. So yeah, so that's all you know, problematic, I would say, in ordinary, you know, states of consciousness. Uh, Now, I think it would be probably a good time to talk about.
No, may I
Yeah, go ahead. Go
conclude
ahead.
my thought? Because yeah, I agree with you. From the perspective of the ordinary state of consciousness, there is an enormous amount of things, an ocean out there and in us, of which we are not aware. Uh, Yet I think that people also now watching normal ordinary human being like me, that has no supplemental realization and is we can relate a bit intuitively to these things, also to we could call the unconscious. It is a bit an oxymoron, because if it is unconscious, you should, per definition, one would say you cannot relate to this. But we know from our personal experience, for example, yeah, when we go to sleep and then we have dreams, sometimes they are not so nice, these dreams. Sometimes they are confused. Yeah, they are unconscious dreams. They're a mess, or that we have nightmares or something like that. That is an aspect of our personality, of our existence, that we know it is somehow in us. But also in the waking state, if we are honest with ourselves, and if we don't tell us fairy tales, we know that a lot of things we do automatically, we do instinctively, or there are things that we would like to get rid of, but that dominate us, and in a certain sense, in the worst case, enslave us. Some automatic instinctual behaviors, confused ideas that come up. Or again, let us take the first person perspective with the mind. Try to silence perfectly your mind for the next 5 hours. Yeah, good luck with that. Yeah, what is that? There are a lot of thoughts that come up and bubble up that one says, why does this thought come up now? It has nothing to do with them. So we can relate to the subconscious domain level, or the plane of existence, or part of consciousness. So as I said, we have the subconscious, the body, the vital, which is our emotionality, the mind, what we call mind. And then I usually don't go much further than that, but include also the supra-conscious, without going into the details of the human mind, higher minds, overmind, and so on. I just say also to this we can relate intuitively through our everyday experience, or if not everyday experience, but sooner or later, every one of us had some intuitive insight in something. There was this aha moment. There was this flash of, I call it flash of knowledge, where you suddenly understand and know something, but you cannot rationally describe how you had this idea. And this has to be distinguished from the subconscious, because or unconscious, because yes, in a sense, it is something that happens without us being directly aware of, and we don't know, but it is of a different quality than the unconscious. The unconscious is, as I said, this instinctive, reactive, automatic, mechanical, frequently chaotic emotions, thoughts that bubble up in our personality. Here we have the opposite. The supraconscious is something that has the opposite, has a luminous quality. So as you use the color metaphor, no? We usually, the unconscious is black, the supraconscious would be white, and what is in between would have different colors, so to speak. That's a metaphor, but I'm not sure that this is completely a metaphor. On the occult level, it appears like that symbolically.
Yeah, or maybe you can think about it as light and darkness,
Yeah,
different degrees of light.
yeah. And the problem is that in the Western mentality, this light and darkness that is not, of which we are not directly aware in our waking consciousness, is put together in a subconscious or unconscious. Also the what we here are now talking about, the supraconscious, they put it together in the subconscious as well, and which is, I think, a big mistake, because these things have to be. So to conclude this thing, I just say we can go inside of us without philosophizing too much and see that these levels of existence are there. The
Yeah.
subconscious,
Yeah.
the body, that's matter, the physical plane, and
Yes.
then there is the vital plane, the plane of emotions. Then there is a plane of the mind, the mental plane, which on the from a holistic perspective becomes a cosmic mind. And then there's the supra-conscious. This is so it might look a bit, yeah, I know here or already here the Western physicalist who would say, oh, I use Occam's razor and cut out all the things. It is a multiplication, useless multiplications or multiplication of entities. I say go inward and you see that these things are there. So let's think in this way, because if you put everything into the same pot, mix it together, you will have a chaos with this. So do you agree
Yes.
that we can have this relatively simplistic, but as a starting point, subconscious, physical, vital, mental, supraconscious. So this
Yes, I think that that would be, and the challenge is to experience these things, but as Sri Aurobindo also has said, different places, ordinary human consciousness is a mishmash of all kinds of things.
yeah.
It's just all thrown together, and so it takes a certain level of concentration to focus and be able to see these
Mm.
distinctions, and so
Yeah,
on.
yeah.
But what you just said, takes us really to a discussion of how is the psyche and our personality organized? Because you were talking about dreams, for example,
Mm.
and we're talking about ordinary consciousness and the lack of organization in dreams. But our ordinary experience seems to have, despite the fact that we're pulled all over the place all the time, but there seems to be a certain organization principle that guides our ordinary waking consciousness, that is lacking in the dream state, when we sleep. So that's a good distinction, and I think is one of the central topics of integral and psychology in general, is that, and that's, the discussion of the ego that, is would be next for us to, as you mentioned, to tackle here. So the ego is usually seen as some bad quality that gets in the way
Mm.
in sometimes in
Usually,
ordinary
yeah.
conversations. That person has a big ego, or that's as if some people don't have, or there's a size to it, or something like that. And in many spiritual traditions, you basically hear ego is something that is an obstruction, of some sort. It gets in the way, or it's a
Mm.
separation principle. It separates you from other people and puts you in a bubble of some sort, and so on. But a lot of these discussions are not very helpful. I think just to briefly say that ego is not defined in the same way in many systems of Western psychology. For example, Freud's idea of ego was very different. He was talking about some reality principle that comes in to check on the id, which was the instinctual part. You talked about the instincts and so on. So the id and the ego, sort of battle, and then the superego is like a referee or something that watches this tension. But and then Jung comes in and he says, well, let's call ego the conscious aspect of personality, not anything else, other than that. So that was technical. Then Assagioli comes in, he says, let's think of ego as the projection of Atman,
Yeah.
uh, or soul on the plane of personality. So that's an interesting definition. It's like as if it's a reflection of something higher, and so on.
Mm.
But all of these are technical discussions and they all have their own places and so on. But there's no one definition of ego, except that over time, ego first was seen by Freud as almost like it was a reality principle, but it was also kind of a bad guy. It was, uh, you know, like a director that had censorship function, and wanted to suppress things. And so there are all these defense mechanisms. So the ego begins to manage reality. It's not like about truth, right? It's about managing phenomenal reality in the conscious world, and suppress and battle the excesses of the instinctive human nature and so on. And then, basically what we have is now over time, ego psychology developed, and there was a more or less an agreement that let's think of ego as a principle of organization of personality rather than anything else, right? So this is a key development here. And if we compare waking consciousness with sleep and dream level of consciousness, we can say that that's the difference there. In waking consciousness, we have our ego to organize our information, and how it gets organized is a long story, and there's so many different theories of human information processing and cognitive processing, and now with neuroscience, as we
Oof.
mentioned in our previous discussions, there are all kinds of theories now
I have
about
no
how
idea.
all
Also, this is a subject where there's still, it is a mystery why we sleep, really, because
yeah.
all the explanation for the evolutionary usefulness of sleep, at the end, you could have this also without sleep. So, what is the
Yeah.
real? But they know, they now understand that there is something missing. Sorry if I
Yeah.
interrupt you.
No, no, that's it. Yeah. And so we have now something of a reliable definition we could use in integral psychology as basically ego as an organization principle of personality.
Wonderful.
Now, I should also say very briefly here, and we'll come back to this. Sri Aurobindo has said that ego can be a helper, but ego is also a bar. So he does bring in that definition of ego getting in the way at some point, but he also says that ego is a helper. The helper is this definition. Ego is the principle of organization of our personality. And can notch it up a little bit more in integral psychology. And this is a development that me, I'm, very much in favor of this. And some other integral psychologists like Paul Herman also brought this up, and I learned this from him, that let's think of ego as not only an organization, but as an embodiment principle, right? Embodiment, that's a key term again. So ego as the embodiment principle. And in Sri Aurobindo's terminology, we talked about parts and planes. So this would be as the embodiment or the organization principle of the outer being, The outer being is our ordinary experience. All the other things we talked about is beyond our normal range of consciousness. But, our physical body, our vital and mental connected to that outer being is what the ego can uh, deal with, in terms of embodiment. And something that I can add to this is that in developmental psychology, we have, for example, Piaget, who talks about different levels of or different stages of development. I won't go into it, but we can think of a similar process. When a child is born and grows, the first year and a half to 2 years, or really ranges, widely, but the baby, the newborn, is in a state of just being born in the physical world and developing a body. It's called the psychomotor stage, right? The body and the brain are just, and there's no self-awareness, The baby is just sitting there. And that's why babies, I think, are so beautiful to look at, because there's something of a deeper quality that is
Mhm.
present, that
Mhm.
we can say it's the soul. The
Mhm.
soul comes through, but there's nothing covered it up yet. The is undifferentiated. The baby and the environment and the parents, they're all sort of one, right? By the time the child begins to walk, uh, about 2 years old, roughly, again, 1.5, 2.5, the vital principle kicks in, the will
Mm.
kicks in. That's when the
Mm.
toddler says no. That's when the toddler runs away from the mother, and shows, because there's a new awareness in the baby that I have power, that because the vital is not just desires, it's actually a principle of power, it's
Mm.
energy, so there's this sort of agency developing, that one begins to feel that, hey, maybe I exist, maybe I can do this, maybe like in the psychomotor stage, if the baby is reaching out to play with something that's dangled in front of them, it's more like a psychomotor exercise to try to reach it and see if it can reach it, and the muscles to grow up, and so on. But there's no awareness of, you know, oh, I can do this, But in the next stage, when the will kicks in, there's also this emerging awareness that, oh, I can do this, I can run, I can say no, I can, I'm somebody, in some sense, in a primitive sense, perhaps. But then by the age 4, roughly again, 3.5 to 4, even 5, there's the mental awareness arising. That's when, this is not present before. There's no self-concept, there's no self-image. Even though the baby might look at the mirror, and see an image of themselves and know that that's me, that's something that happens very mysteriously, very quickly in human beings, whereas only some animals are capable of doing that, and some of them totally clueless, like tigers and bears in front of a mirror in forest. They basically think there's somebody else there and they fight
Yeah.
it. But this immediate awareness becomes then elaborated with input from the environment, and this sort of new voice develops in the head, new imagery that is all mental now. So as you see, the development of the ego goes through this process of physical, vital, and mental
Mm.
evolution. That's not something that we often talk about. So this process of development of the ego as an organization and an embodiment principle is something that is necessary, it's natural, and it grows up to adulthood and beyond, so that's something that we cannot dispense with. And I would say here very quickly that any theory of mysticism, and Sri Aurobindo is saying this exactly same thing, that any kind of individuality idea that crushes this is not good, because we know now, not in integral psychology necessarily, but we know in Western psychology too, that any impediment in this development process that I'm just talking about can cause all sorts of problems, psychological problems. So I say with some certainty that a healthy ego development is an important foundation for spiritual practice in integral psychology. There are others that I've sometimes had conversations with who think that, well, there may be a way that, we can rely on a higher power to transform us and so on. And I'm sure that that's possible. But I think also it's important to remember that healthy ego development is important because uh, you know, if the ego is not healthy, it definitely becomes an obstruction to any kind of development in the future. It definitely becomes a separation principle, and it definitely becomes, even narcissistic and self-centered, and a total antagonism to spiritual development. And so, I think it's important to pay attention to anything that helps us develop that. And part of integral counseling psychology is really directed at this, that Haridas Chaudhuri insight that I spoke about previously, that there needs to be a connection between psychology and spirituality, because the problems that people seem to think is spiritual, they're actually psychological
Yeah.
problems. But these psychological issues need to be
Yeah.
addressed, and hopefully need to be resolved. If they're not resolved, we often have wrong foundations for spiritual developments that
Yeah.
lead to nowhere. You know, one of the most important one of these is called spiritual bypassing, right? Spiritual bypassing is when someone with alienation from the world and maybe themselves and the society and so on resorts to spiritual practices and meditation and spiritual teachings, but wants to escape into this higher place where, you know, there's no pain and there's no suffering and there's only peace. And so unconsciously or unknowingly, this person, maybe there's ways to even get there. There are definitely ways to focus and to
Mhm.
get into very pleasant and even higher development of consciousness, but leaving behind the development of the embodied being, which is in the world, is not something that we want in integral psychology, integral yoga
That's
psychology.
why we call it also integral, because
That's right.
it, it,
That's right.
it tries to integrate the, yeah,
Yeah.
the
I mean,
higher levels with the lower levels, and the physical with the spiritual. And so,
yeah. I think the way Sri Aurobindo has talked about it is that, you know, in traditional yogas, you know, in the past, you know, um, there have been a lot of attempts to go to the highest possible
mm,
planes of consciousness, become one with the non-dual, and you know, and with that comes a philosophy of understanding that the world is full of suffering, and so there has been no attempt to really correct and transform embodied personality because it seems like something that's gotten in the way, and all we have to do is find
yeah,
a way out. And there's I've heard even from spiritual teachers metaphors like we're like a fly trapped in a bottle that is just constantly bouncing around trying to get out. But what you have to do is find concentration and meditation to just quiet down all this craziness and then find your way out of the bottle, you know, which is a nice metaphor. But you want to get out of this world because there's something better. But the you know question again back in integral psychology is like, but why are we embodied beings?
yeah,
You know, and so
exactly.
Sri Aurobindo basically turns the whole thing upside down and says, you know, he's not interested in these escapisms. You know, even though they're spiritual
Yeah.
and they're good things in some sense, but we need to look at embodied being. We need to transform that. So the question becomes, how do we do this? You know, in the past 40 years of history or 50 years of history of
So, yeah,
transpersonal psychology in the West, this idea of transformation is such a buzzword, you know, but do we really have any clear practical ideas about how transformation is possible? I think we can find that in integral psychology, but
yeah.
not so much.
Let's get there
Uh,
in a moment, because now then no, there remains still a question that I would like you to go into a little bit, because I think I can relate quite well, because I was one of of them who see these things or hear about these things for the first time. What is the distinction now? Because we have not gone too much into the soul and the psychic being. What is now the distinction between the ego and the soul? Because you say a principle of organization or embodiment of personality. With my naive understanding of metaphysics, I could say this is the soul, but that's not in integral psychology and integral yoga. No? The soul is something very different. So let's make, first of all, this distinction, and then I would like to put this into the evolution involution context. Yeah.
yeah.
So what is the distinction now? How would you explain to people there's this distinction between the ego and the soul from the Western perspective, and then from the perspective of Sri Aurobindo, where there is this
Yeah.
evolutionary standpoint?
Yes. Well, from the Western perspective, there's literally not so much
Yeah.
s- ego. I mean, there's ego, but not soul, you know.
Yeah,
So there is Jung and there's Roberto Assagioli
yeah,
who have brought that in, you know, in transpersonal psychology. They're the founders of transpersonal psychology. So that's pretty much the answer there. In integral psychology and in Western ego psychology, both, ego is the principle of normal personality, how we understand it in normal psychology,
mm.
in
No
mainstream
personality.
psychology, right? Uh, in integral psychology, ego is the principle of the outer being, which I equate with embodied being. So the outer being is the embodied being, is what we uh, experience immediately, is how we are in the world. You know, the inner being is something that we might have an intuition about, or something that we may need to access through meditation or through other possible things, sometimes through other methods that take us to alternative states of consciousness. But basically, uh, normal day-to-day consciousness is embodied, and it's the organization principle is the ego. For the most part, though, still, I would say ego is not a conscious principle. It's not something that people know. Most people don't know. And it's something that you can accuse someone else of having an ego or a big ego or something, but you never see that in yourself. You know, that it's not something that, you know, is readily available to us. But from a sort of theoretical point of view, if you will, or even from a practical point of view, that's what governs the outer personality. Now, the inner being is governed by the soul,
Mm.
by, you know, that principle. So ideally, at some point, if the two become one, that is, if the ego allows the soul to come into the picture from the background, because the soul is in the inner being, right? And is in the center of the inner being. And being there is not something that's available to us on a normal day-to-day basis. So if we allow that soul principle to be accessed intuitively and become more available, more conscious to us, then there will be a possibility of transformation. But let's also talk about for a second what a little more detail of what is soul in integral psychology, because then the idea of the dialogue between the soul and the ego becomes more meaningful. In integral psychology or integral yoga psychology, Aurobindo talks about uh, you know, at least two different centers. You know, there's the Jivatma and there's the psychic being, you know. There's more detail to that, you know, but I will probably skip that right now. But let's imagine it like this, you know, in the course of creation, we said there's Brahman, and in Brahman, there's the seed of individuality, which is Atman, right? Now, Jivatman would be a connection that each soul has with Atman, you know, or with Brahman, because Atman and Brahman are really one thing, right? So mine and yours and everyone's Jivatman is this principle of transcendence that is connected to the ultimate or transcendent principle. That is one level of it. It's beyond our normal range of consciousness. It's in the higher regions. But there's something of a polarity also. There's maybe like almost like a bifurcation of Atman into Jivatman, and then there's this other principle which is involved in the lowest levels of consciousness, which is the inconscient, which is the psychic being, you know, or Chaitya Purusha, which is a more technical term. But
But the
this,
psychic being is not part of of the unconscious. The psychic being is something transcendent. It
well,
is a spark of the divine, no? Isn't it?
that's yes, the psychic being in essence is a spark of the divine, and in some sense it's equivalent to Jivatman. But
Mhm.
Sri Aurobindo clearly distinguishes that Jivatman stays above, it's always in the transcendent realm, and it provides that link with the ultimate consciousness or the transcendent consciousness for us. But that spark, when it shows up in the middle of the densest levels of consciousness
Yeah.
and begins to guide the process of an upward evolution, as we spoke before. Eventually it becomes the agency that accumulates in interactions and experiences in these different levels of consciousness. And these experiences are sometimes called samskaras.
Mhm.
Samskaras are impressions, that are made. Like for example, a plant has interaction with the environment. It receives impressions, if there's light, if there's water, anything that's in the environment puts an impression on this plant. So that plant is able to process these impressions and make use of them. So in the same way as we go from the, stone level, or from the,
Yeah.
physical to densest physical to the more vital level, these impressions also evolve, and with it, various creatures form, So we have the mineral, and then we
We're
have
not
the,
just say that this is an evolutionary soul, a soul that develops and grows with the evolutionary process in matter. Yeah.
yes, and it gathers experiences.
Gathers it. Yeah.
These experiences, as it goes from the, stone to vegetable to animal, and then eventually to the human, these experiences become part of a cluster, if you will, or a formation around that core spark that has been leading this process. That core spark is the key to the intelligence behind evolution. It
Yeah.
guides it from way in the back, and even the mother or others may have had the experience of, when you look into the densest levels of the physical from a yogic perspective, you'll see something of a supramental light
Yeah.
hidden in that, So I think modern physics may be able to sooner or later actually discover something about that. But anyway, that process, uh, this formation that comes up is what we call the psychic being in terms of Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. And that psychic being is something that evolves over time and becomes more and more perfected, and it becomes a foundation of who we are, and the station of our soul, or where our soul is in the larger
But
scheme of things.
one thing must be said, it must be clarified that this is cannot avoid some form of theory of transmigration, of reincarnation, of a soul that has many lives. Here, the West, especially, I would say, those who are rooted in a culture of the not only Christian, the Abrahamic religions, need to make the effort, if they want to accept this metaphysical cosmology, that reincarnation is part of the process. Because otherwise it would not make much sense, because I would say, okay, I mean, there's a psychic being, but when I die, that's all. And if I'm not developed sufficiently, I will fall back in some unconscious universe forever. Which in a sense would also confirm some sort of, in my personal view, questionable metaphysical understandings of this of karma and sin, and that you will go to hell and things like that. So this psychic entity, yeah, there's also a psychic entity, but psychic being is the part of us that reincarnates from life to life in a bodily existence. Yeah. So you agree with this characterization? Yes.
Yes, I would say that, in Western philosophy, or, in old Greek philosophy, there have been notions of soul, for example,
Yeah.
Socrates and Plato and so on, the immortality of the soul, and all of that.
Was not evolution.
Uh, yeah, and the idea of what they called metempsychosis was
Yeah.
something that Pythagoras and other more mystical philosophers, had brought up, because there seemed to be something behind our outer being or ordinary human being that is more mysterious. And but in the evolution of consciousness and mysticism as a whole, I think these ideas have become more and more
Yeah.
developed, and experiences of these have become very clear and more firm. And so, metempsychosis might have suggested some kind of a random soul going from one life
Yeah.
to another. I'm a plant in this life, and maybe I become a bird in the next life, and then
Yeah.
maybe become something else in the third life. But
Very, yeah.
those are, misunderstandings about the idea that, this is not, clearly understood as a whole process. But the only mysticism that I know of that comes very close to this is Rumi, in Sufism, who
Yeah.
has had poetry about the evolution of the soul from the mineral to the vegetable to the animal to the human, and then beyond to the higher realms, and so on. It's definitely laid out in.
Describe it also in the center behind the heart, right? Having the dimension, he also, exactly like in the Veda, he described it as something having not more the size of a thumb in a center behind the physical heart, but which is not physical, this psychic being, even though we relate to it through our feeling when there is this psychic opening as something that is connected to our body in this sense. Yeah. Yeah, I think he also had this description. So it isn't cannot be coincidental. These you have this in different cultures. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think Sufi psychology in general has its own sort of parts and planes, but not as detailed in this sense. But they do have an inner being and outer being, and there's also this idea that the heart, which is the spiritual
Mhm.
heart, the heart chakra,
Mhm.
is the mediator between the soul, which is, the transcendent principle, and the ego or nafs, which is the embodied principle. So, there's this sort of soul in the background, and the heart is what facilitates, and it also is the principle of the vital level, all the regulating all the emotions, purifying all of our emotions, just the same way that physical heart purifies blood, So there's something similar in that.
Yeah.
But in
Interesting.
Sri Aurobindo, yeah, in Sri Aurobindo, there's, something of a very clear distinction, that in order to find the inner being, you have to sort of go, more, in that direction. But then you'll find that the inner vital and the inner below that, the inner physical, and then the inner mental above that. And so the heart is its center of the inner vital, is the higher range, and so it's sort of behind in here. But again, this is where it gets very tricky, because this behind does not mean in a three-dimensional
Yeah. Mm.
mathematical space,
Yeah.
because this is where it gets very difficult to talk about mysticism and these things, because if you try to go from the physical heart through a kind of XYZ axis, you'll find nothing there,
I
there's
know
nothing
this. I
there,
know this.
but they say find the flame, that is at the core of the heart, the flame that's at the core of the inner being. This other mystical traditions have
Mm.
talked about that flame, as well. So that flame is that light, is that golden light, which is, associated with that spark, with the divine spark, that maybe, in a more fundamental way, it's a supramental spark of some sort, but in a
Mm.
more sort of casual way, or the way it appears to us, is more like flame or something like that, But yes, this center there is the center of our true being. But what happens, again, look at this developmentally. The soul comes, and we're born into the physical plane, but we're coming up from unconsciousness, right? We're developing, a baby is basically unconscious, right? Baby comes full unconsciousness in the body. I mean, just because there's some movement or kicking in the womb, it doesn't mean that there's real consciousness. There could be movement
But it is
without
the baby
consciousness.
is sentient. Do you
Yeah.
agree that it is
Yes, yes,
sentient?
it's sentient. It's a
Yeah.
being. It's a being.
Yeah, but there are some philosophers who deny that a baby until the age of 3 years is completely unconscious in the sense that it
No, no,
ends.
no, no,
I,
no,
I
no,
don't understand how people can think in
no.
this way. I mean, I see a baby, I see it has pain and pleasure, laughs and
Oh,
cries.
oh, there's
So
so much more. There's so
yeah,
much. Absolutely.
yeah,
No, no, I think, again, I think probably that mistake that some people make is that because by the age 3 or 4, you begin to have a sort of mental formation for your ego,
yeah,
and then there becomes some kind of awareness of I am someone, and I'm separate individual and so on and so forth. But that's no indication of the whole process is very complex in terms of how the soul prepares for the descent into the matter and all this
yeah,
happens. But basically, we our immediate experience is born in the unconscious realm more than the conscious realm. And so over time, as we grow and we develop mental consciousness, we begin to become mentally conscious, but we're still not very conscious of the inner being and the soul. There are exceptions to that, I would say. There are people who have a very strong intuitive sense of soul that remains with them throughout their development. And these are probably the people who will very soon reject a lot of the teachings that come from the outside and the things that try to force them to go in certain directions. And they guide a person to, go in a direction of spiritual development. That's their destiny. And there are even more exceptional beings like, certain spiritual, high spiritual beings who are born as human beings and they are very aware, very early of their divinity and so on. Of course, the mother, for example, is a great example of that and so on. But there are many more. So this doesn't apply to everyone across the board. There are a lot of individual differences, but the main principle that we're talking about here is that our ego development in the outer being is not aware of this. So the soul is in the background and it still does what it needs to do in terms of sustaining the whole being, but it cannot play a role in the governance of day-to-day life until it's allowed. At least there's a receptivity on the outer level of the ego level. So that's why the transformation of ego becomes really, really important in
yeah,
integral yoga. If we had a different yoga goal, that was not transformation of the physical body and embodied being, we could find a way to access the soul and through that, go all the way up and become one with the ultimate, you know. But that would mean that we'd have to leave our outer being, outer
yeah.
development aside. That's not the goal of
Yeah,
integral yoga.
Sherobino speaks often, very often about that we should, he has a very grounded understanding of spirituality, not something
Yes.
that you have in a realization and then but I think this is nowadays, it is a message that has been accepted mostly also. When I hear non-dual teachers, for example, there are many nowadays, no? Uh, you see that they not so far, they did not go so far as Sherobino in the sense of not at all, but uh, uh, they don't preach no longer this alienation from the physical world. They also speak of grounding oneself, integrating, and they are becoming aware yeah, that their journey did not
Yeah.
finish there. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, it's interesting how integral insights, which is, that this is the time and the era for that. This is how these things are infiltrating, as I mentioned to you
yeah, yeah,
earlier, in transpersonal psychology, for example, is they're definitely not talking about transformation. They're talking about embodiment, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
These are all the things that was not part of the discourse in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and so on,
absolutely. Yeah.
you know.
But that's
But
what we are doing here now. We are trying to
yes.
infiltrate like thieves in the night. Huh?
It's in the atmosphere, you know, it's in the zeitgeist, you know, and
Zeitgeist, yeah.
so, you know, people pick this up and some of them may or may not reconcile all this together, but they're in a position of teaching, so they offer the best that they have, but there's not usually a comprehensive picture behind that. And that's why I really
Exactly.
appreciate the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo because of this comprehensiveness of it, you know.
Exactly. And that's the comprehensive picture that I would like to emphasize also in these sessions, because now we have seen several dots. Let's see if I can somehow connect the dots and bring the whole into this comprehensive picture. Because let me take up again the evolution, because essentially from the cosmic perspective, yeah, everything begins with Brahman, that individuates itself into something that is still itself in itself, but no longer transcendent, but manifest. Yeah. So we begin, all because what I'm trying to intuitively convey is this is about a spiritual emergentism. I call it spiritual emergentism, where the spirit emerges in and through matter. Whereas in the Western perspective, in the scientific realism, we have the opposite. The things has been twisted upside down. There is first matter, it comes out of nothing, and nobody knows how this Big Bang comes out of nothing, creates all the stars, planets, and galaxies, and then for fortuitous coincidence, genetic molecules come together, form the first biological chemical molecules, macromolecules, the DNA, the cells come up, and then sooner or later these biological organizations become so complex that then consciousness emerges. Whereas here, it goes the other way around. Everything begins with consciousness. There is the spirit, Brahman, the universal consciousness, God, the divine, whatever you would like to call it, that plunges itself into its own manifestation, which is a projection of itself, into what we call matter. And from there, in a sort of forget, and this is a spark, the divine spark, the psychic being, the soul, then incarnates and forgetful of its origin, grows into matter and emerges in and through out of matter, and then manifests consciousness. But it is not matter that creates consciousness and produces consciousness. So, because I think but I don't think only Western, because also this distinction between East and West is nowadays, I don't think it makes much more sense. Let's say it in the scientific perspective. From the scientific perspective, there's still very strong this Darwinian evolution concept, which here we don't negate, we accept this. There is this Darwinian evolution, but we cannot reduce evolution only to that. The Darwinian aspect is only a surface appearance of a process that grows from the inside out. No? And that's why I call it spiritual. It not only me, this is also in a way that is coming through the philosophy of mind, modern mind, the spiritual emergentism, where the spirit emerges in and through matter, but is the first principle. It's not the last outcome. So we have this universal consciousness, let's call it that manifests itself in the universe through matter, and then through these divine sparks, plunges itself into matter, and there a slow ionic evolution comes into being, and that's what we call Darwinian evolution. But the evolutionary process is first of all an involution. There's first an involution of the spirit that then grows out from matter through matter, and that's what we call evolution. And which is not only a physical evolution of the body, because according to modern biology, there is speciation, there are the different genetic, there is a morphology, there is the expression of the morphological traits through the genes and so on. But this is physical evolution. Inside each organism, there is also this psychic entity, psychic being, which grows through this evolutionary process. And this creates a personality, and the principle of organization of this personality is what we call the ego. Yeah? But the transmigration, if we accept this idea of the incarnation of the psychic being that grows from life to life, it's not the ego that incarnates, it is a psychic being that experiences and grows from life to life. Whereas the personality, the ego, is something temporary, I would say. It's temporary, perhaps, but I don't know if it's only temporary for our life, but as long we don't, after death, because here again, we are very metaphysical setting where when we die, we leave the body, but here now these planes come into the play. Sorry for the word play. There is, the body is gone, but the mind and the vital and the psychic being can still be there also after the experience of the departure of the physical body. Then, yeah, we can also go into more cool things. Then there's a process where also the mind dies out, and at the end, and the vital dies out, and then we go into psychic rest, and then the soul prepares for the next life. But okay, this we can eventually leave this out. But important is to see the concept of involution and evolution and how it relates to our soul. This soul, this soul that is not just a static soul, but it is something that changes with the experiences that it makes during its lifetimes. Whereas the ego, again, is the outer expression in this embodiment, yeah, of the soul, but is not the soul. Because this is, especially this thing, I think is very important to underline, because otherwise, according to my education, the ego and the soul, the mind, consciousness, the desires and the emotions and the will and all this, it's all the one thing, which here it is not. And we don't do this because we like to multiply entities and with coming up with contrived theories. But if we go inward, we see that this is the reality. That is, if that's how truth is, why do we have to cut out everything and reduce it to only one or two entities? Then we must go beyond a simplistic dualism. We have to speak about them. I once used the word multidimensionality, and then I discovered that people, here again, they with the words have meaning, and if we don't clarify what the meaning of words is, then too often we conflate things or make a lot of confusion. Then people thought of this multidimensionality of our being and the planes and parts of existence are to be intended in the geometrical sense, as you also said. It's not about geometry. These dimensions are not the dimensions of the physicist or of the mathematician. these are psychological dimensions, yet they have a distinction. And as the last thing that I would like also to add is that to these levels, what I did not emphasize sufficiently, I think, is that there is the universal aspect and the individual aspect. Because when I say we have a body, the body is a physical aspect of the individuality. But there's a physical universe that is a universal physical plane. The same fits also with the mind. There is an individuated mind, that my mind, your mind, this distinction, this duality, this fragmentation of minds, but they are connected to the universal mind. So we have a universal and individual plane. And the same thing, and this is hard to swallow for the Darwinist, that we have also not only an individuated life body, but we live also inside a life, cosmic life. That's the thing that Darwinian would probably say, no, 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 no. Life is an epiphenomenon of matter. Whereas here we have a little different understanding. We say the physical evolution, the Darwinian evolution, is an expression of a universal life that existed already before the Big Bang, yeah, so to speak. Yeah, but okay, I don't go into these metaphysical details, but important is that we see also this duality of universal and individual, individual and universal. And each plane of universal existence has its individuation in mind, matter, body, and then also subconscious, the subconscious universal. There's also something like that. And the supra-conscious universal, and its individuation in us where we can transcend our waking state and get into contact with these different planes. So I hope I made a not too contrived and not too long summary, but I wanted to do that because perhaps we can complement each other, yeah? Because I already here I'm so acquainted with this Western perspective, this scientific perspective, how they would come up with certain questions and doubts and skepticism that I'm trying to address.
Yes, Marco, this is probably a very good place to wrap up right now because I think I can say, I mean, for at least for this session,
Yeah,
I think that there are things to be said about the transformation of the ego
exactly.
and how that happens and all of that. So, but just one last note, I think you're quite right about all these things that you said, and I would say that distinction between evolution of form and evolution of consciousness is key to understanding. I think evolution of form is something that, even though it ultimately reflects evolution of consciousness, it's in the service of evolution of consciousness.
Yeah,
But Western systems have not really paid attention to this distinction, mostly because consciousness itself is not well understood yet. So it really, the key problem right now, I think, in front of us in the West is how to understand consciousness. This is in psychology, this is in physics, and cosmology and all of that. And there are discussions starting around all of that, but usually in the extreme alternative, corners, but nothing of a well-established conversation yet. So, but I think, we can leave it for
yeah,
now here that, that our outer being needs to be transformed for the purposes of spiritual development, and then we can pick up on this and,
yeah. The next time we can discuss also more about the practical aspect of integral psychology. But here we laid down the basics because otherwise we don't know what we are talking about. So, yeah, Bahman, I think this was a very nice conversation. And I would suggest we continue with this thing. With the next time we can go through the transformation, as you said. Yeah. So let's see if we How can, okay, how we can, well, here we are there. How can the ego be transformed? We can, yeah, more or less on the halfway of your list. Let's see how we can proceed with this. Okay.